Hello, I'm Dr. Mary Wild. I'm a pediatrician now located in Utah, but my roots are in Minnesota, and my heart is going out to those in Minnesota who are struggling right now. I decided to create this Zoom group, Standing with Families, to offer some support and emotional regulation tools. Things seem very surreal right now. If you're in the heart of the turmoil, they feel surreal for some reasons. And then if you're away from it, it feels surreal for other reasons. I'm across the country, and what feels surreal to me right now is that in many arenas, there is no mention of what is happening elsewhere. And it's almost like there's this oblivion of the suffering that is going on in certain groups and families and across our nation. So when I saw this painting by Salvador Dali, I really resonated with this image of this fragmentation. As a pediatrician, as a mother, as a parenting coach and mentor, I have learned that the importance of the state of our nervous system is one of the foundational things that we bring to help our kids. And the phrase that I coined related to an ideal state that I would like to show up with in parenting is this idea of grounded, loving presence. And you can learn more of that. There's a TEDx talk that I did a number of years ago um, talking about this idea of grounded, loving presence and how we arrive at it and why it's so important. If we as parents can come to this place of feeling regulated, then we're so much more able to help our children be regulated and act with wisdom and according to our values. The literature related to childhood trauma and ACEs, those are adverse childhood experiences, tells us that one of the most important things that can buffer children against trauma, and truly many families are experiencing trauma right now, is to have one supportive adult. And oftentimes you as the parent are that supportive adult to your children. But we also can be supportive adults to other adults and to the children in our community, people on our kids' sports teams, in our kids' schools. And do not underestimate the power of this at buffering the traumas that are taking place. I've created a resource for families called Talking to Children in Times of Turmoil. And I think it's important to realize that kids do not experience things in the same way that we do as adults. And I've had several experiences remind me of this. A couple that come to mind. One, it was many years ago when I lived in Minnesota, and we had a backyard garden and we had tomatoes in our garden. And I was telling my young son, I need to run out and grab the tomatoes, even the green ones, before they're hit with frost because the plants are going to die. The tomatoes are going to get spoiled and ruined. So I'm going to go and gather them. And he just looked very um, thoughtful for a little bit. And he said, I licked the frost. Am I going to die too? And it hadn't occurred to me that linking the idea of frost with a plant dying would cause my son to feel threatened. Um, Another recent experience, I love to sing, and I was recently in an opera production of Hansel and Gretel. And in this story, Hansel and Gretel are lost in the woods, and there's a evil witch who tries to convince them to go into the oven so she can bake them and make them into gingerbread children and eat them. And they find a way to push her into the oven. And we were doing the school outreach production of this opera, and we had a Q&A session at the end, and one child raised their hand and said, how is the witch back? How is she standing here now? He literally thought when she got pushed in the oven that she would disappear and wouldn't come back. And so it's just important to recognize that at different developmental stages, children absorb things differently. So I've created this tool for you to utilize, to share, and there's a link to get your own copy of that. I want to acknowledge the duality that exists, and I think this is part of the surrealism that we feel this, these contrasting experiences around us. And I think it was captured really well in this post. It says, the world is both burning and blooming. You get the bad news and the sunrise in the same day. You cry over the headlines, then you laugh at a baby wearing a hat shaped like a bear. This is the dual citizenship of being alive, rage and reverence, grief and grace. You are allowed to feel both. You are allowed to scream and still notice how good the soup is. You don't have to choose. Let it all in. I think that is one thing that causes us to feel paralyzed and frozen in this time, is that we kind of don't know how to react to this duality. And we almost feel like knowing and acknowledging that there are troubling things in the headlines kind of negates the validity of the small positive experiences that we're having moment to moment, but it doesn't need to. This complex duality is part of the human experience, and it's important to be able to still move forward. I created this slide because I think it's very interesting that the word emotion has the word motion in it. Many of us are empaths, and we just absorb the feelings of the world and the feelings and the suffering of the people around us. And it is hard to feel like we can even go forward, sometimes with the heaviness of it. But remember that the word motion is part of the word emotion, that we can be feeling these things and still moving forward. And interestingly, some of the things that hold us frozen or paralyzed are activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. But first, I just wanted to acknowledge that in Minnesota, we know how to stay warm. We know how to keep ourselves in motion so we don't freeze. I remember when I was a young girl, the Twins were going to be in the World Series, and our family actually camped outside in the downtown Minneapolis streets on lawn chairs to wait in line to get tickets for the World Series. And in order to do this, we had to keep moving, jump around, and we didn't get tickets. But it was a good reminder that, we can combat this freeze type experience as we stay in motion. That doesn't mean we always have to be in motion. Sometimes the right thing to do is to pause and to ground ourselves, but we can experience feelings and still move and do and act. I want to just acknowledge this infographic, this concept that comes from Stephen Covey, these ideas of circles of control. I think one of the first things that sometimes we need to do is locate ourselves in this concept of, which circle am I in? Is this, this thing I'm feeling emotion about, is it something I have control over? Is it something I have influence over? Or is it something I just have concern over? And then there's this whole external portion where it's kind of it's beyond our awareness. And many people are existing very peacefully right now because they are kind of in the circle of oblivion. And perhaps that's not the place to be either. But it's interesting because during times of turmoil and struggle and trauma, our circles can get distorted. Rather than having a balanced circumference, sometimes the control piece, the sense of control can shrink, and the sense of influence can shrink, and we just feel so much concern for the world and for our situation and the situation in the world, but we really have lost sight of the influence and the control that we do have. And this is really perhaps termed as empathetic distress, but it can cause us to freeze and to not act when there could be something that we could do. I want to go over the idea of the stress response system. This is the fight, flight, or freeze system. It's a normal protective response. So if you feel paralyzed right now, if you feel unable to move forward, I just want you to know that that is normal. When our stress response system or our sympathetic nervous system is activated, it creates a cascade of events. It increases our heart rate, it increases our breathing rate. It causes more blood flow to go to our large muscle groups, less blood flow to go to our small muscle groups, our brain, our digestive system. It causes our pupils to dilate. So, we are trying to get out the door and we can't find our keys even though they're right in front of us because we have more of this big picture survival sense. So this sympathetic nervous system activation is the same kind of thing that can blind ourselves to the idea that there are things around us that we can do because we can't even see them. We are having this scanning survival protective mechanism take over and become blind to the small actions that we can take. So as I have alluded to, there are really two nervous systems. There's a sympathetic nervous system, which is our alarm system and can cause that freeze response. And then there's the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is more the nervous system for rest and connection. I did record a podcast episode recently in my Compassion Parenting podcast, and it's entitled The Myth of Powerlessness. And if you go to bit.ly/melt, capital melt, the freeze, then you'll be able to find that podcast episode. But it really talks about my realization that I was in the sympathetic nervous system and in sympathetic nervous system domination. and I was just frozen. I felt like I couldn't do anything. And I realized that there were things that I could do. So I invite you to take a listen to that podcast. It's just about 7 minutes long. I want to talk a little bit about the anxiety equation because I work a lot with anxious kids and anxious families. And even if we don't have clinical anxiety, many of us feel anxious right now. And this anxiety equation still holds true. So we feel anxiety when our perception of risk exceeds our perception of the resources. And so when risk is big, anxiety is big. And many of us try to combat our anxiety by hiding. We decrease the risk. We don't take healthy risks. We don't put ourselves out there, fighting for causes that we really believe in because we are afraid. And we don't feel like we have the resources to support us. But I would like to propose a different approach, and that is to build our resource collection. And then we can take healthy risks and risks that align with our value system to do good in the world, to put ourselves out there, to use our talents and gifts and positions and platforms to bring about good without making our anxiety grow as much when we support ourselves with resources. So in my practice, I consider myself an integrative pediatrician, and I teach mind, body, and spirit practices to regulate the nervous system. And often the go-to approaches are, if a child is experiencing anxiety or an adult is experiencing anxiety, it's like, okay, do we send them to therapy or do we prescribe something, some type of medication? But I know through my training, and I think we all know in an intuitive way, that there's so many other ways to address anxiety. Certainly, cognitive behavioral therapy can be very beneficial. Medication is sometimes needed, but there are all these other tools that can be so powerful to help us regulate ourselves. And as we've discussed, when we are regulated, not only can we help regulate the people around us, like our children, we also are in a wise mind state. And so we're much more much more likely to act in accordance with our value system and take important, wise actions. So these other tools I will just touch upon briefly. In terms of mind tools, there are cognitive practices where we can think of thought catching, and there's also mindfulness practices. There's the use of imagery to adjust how we think about the world around us. Then there are body tools, things that help us to increase our vagal tone or the parasympathetic nervous system influence over us. We can use diaphragmatic breathing. We can do vigorous exercise. We can use yoga, aromatherapy, grounding practices. There are certain lifestyle factors that help us just be in our most healthy state through nutrition and sleep and exercise and balanced use of media and things. There are tools of tapping or the emotional freedom technique. There are additional deep dives you can do in terms of doing testing for deficiencies and looking into supplementing to optimize your health. There are spirit practices, and often these are some of the most neglected. These can be religious or spiritual practices, journaling, wisdom literature, and inspiring quotes, participating in the arts, doing service, participating and having gratitude practices, working at our relationships and building connection, taking time in nature, experiencing laughter. So these are all things that we can use to regulate our nervous system. I would like to just teach one tool today, and this is one of my favorite mindfulness tools. This I learned from Dr. Tara Brach, and I have her website here. She has some additional tools on her website. But this idea of self-compassion and compassion are so valuable in times of turmoil and stress and struggle to help us feel more regulated. So I'm going to go through these different steps. And first, I'll acknowledge that mindfulness is really a non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. And you think, what? Non-judgmental? Like, I have a lot of opinions about what's going on right now. And of course, it's not a suspension of a value system or the idea of right and wrong, but it's just kind of stepping back for a moment and holding your circumstance, holding your emotions with curiosity rather than judgment, so you can just look at them more clearly. So R is recognize, and that is first recognizing what is your emotional state at the moment. So naming that feeling, like maybe I feel sadness. I feel sadness for what others are experiencing, or I feel fear. I feel confusion. You know, all of these can be present. So recognizing what different emotions are making up your current state. And sometimes with the kids that I work with, I also have them rate the intensity of those emotions just to kind of really have a pulse on it in an accurate way. And that's really the first step, is to name and acknowledge. The next one is allow. A is for allow, allowing yourself to be experiencing these things, acknowledging that any person in your same position would naturally feel what you're feeling. And so suspending the self-judgment and just giving yourself permission to feel what you're feeling. And then I is investigate. And this is not investigation in a very analytical sense, but it is more a curious inquiry, asking yourself, where in my body do I feel these feelings? You know, if you feel a sense of confusion, maybe it's kind of a sense of uneasiness in your stomach, or maybe if you feel a sense of sadness, maybe it's a kind of hollowness or a aching in your chest. But recognizing that the emotion is contained usually in a in a specific place. So though you may be experiencing sadness, likely you're not feeling it in your index finger or in your earlobe or in your toes. So it allows us to feel a little bit like the emotion is being contained. Now, the next step is nurture. And in some ways, this is wide open because it is saying, what is the most nurturing action I could take? And this is action that is aligned with your deepest goals and values. So, in some ways, we might feel like, oh, I just want to crawl under my covers and get in my bed and not get out. And that might be the right thing in the moment, but I don't think that it would be the final solution. Likely, if there's something that is causing an emotion in us, there's something that needs to be addressed or acknowledged or acted upon or communicated. And so sometimes this can be a very simple action. For example, earlier, when I was feeling a sense of powerlessness, I allowed myself to feel powerless, recognizing many people feel powerless right now. I didn't necessarily formally go through this experience and pinpoint where I was feeling it in my body, but the nurturing action I took is to say, I have platforms. I can do something. And so I wrote a podcast episode and recorded it. And it was just one small action. I don't know if anyone will listen to it or maybe it will help a handful of people, but it helped me to get into a state of motion rather than paralysis. I also want to share this modified Tonglen meditation. So Tonglen is really an idea of sending and receiving. And often it is the idea of receiving the sorrow and the suffering in the world as you breathe in, and then breathing out compassion. But sometimes, particularly for those of us who are empaths, it can be difficult to feel like we're receiving that suffering, but it can be helpful to think of it as receiving the compassion in the world or breathing in a common experience. So whichever way you would like to think of it. We begin by taking a few grounding breaths, breathing in and breathing out. And then as we inhale, we think of receiving the compassion and the communal sense from all living beings who are sharing our experience. And then we can exhale our compassion into the world and exhale a sense of comfort. And this exercise can be expanded to a deeper practice, first sending, receiving and sending emotions, even just thinking of ourselves. Then we can extend it to the idea of sending and receiving from loved ones, then perhaps maybe a neutral person, then perhaps someone who is hard to love, and then all beings. It reminds me of trees and how they absorb the carbon dioxide and give oxygen. And it's that oxygen, that common compassion that we can give to each other that's actually a palpable thing that can help heal the world at this time and help heal us. So as we breathe in, there is actually a metabolic process that's going on where we are converting the oxygen to carbon dioxide. And so it's just this sending and receiving between us and the trees. And it represents kind of a metabolization that happens with this suffering, that it doesn't have to stay sadness and grief, but it can have this transformation within us and turn into something healing and beautiful and compassionate. Here are some mantras that may be helpful at this time, and you can think of these if they're useful or write your own and think of your own. One is, I rest by moving, and that connects with this idea of emotion. And yeah, especially helpful for those of us who feel like we don't have the opportunity to pause, but we gain rest by taking aligned actions that are feeding and fueling our value system and our heart. The next one is, I am in the eye of the storm. So we can have the storm swirling around us. And sometimes I feel like this as a parent. I am a mom to 8 boys, and sometimes it feels pretty chaotic out there, but I remind myself that I can still have peace within myself, regardless of what's going on. And being in that peaceful state helps me decide how to interact with that storm that is out on the outside. And then another one that was sent to me by a friend who also works in the mental health space in Minnesota. It is this: pause, the world can wait. And I think that this is helpful when we're feeling bombarded by all the things calling for us and pulling at us, and giving ourselves permission to pause. And it's true that in times of crisis, sometimes the world can't wait for certain actions. And so we do have to rest by moving. So we can adjust and maybe move between these mantras as needed. But thank you for sharing this time with me. I am planning on holding this weekly meeting, standing with families as it's needed, as it's perceived as useful. And I would love to share tools that we can use as parents to regulate ourselves so we can show up wisely in the world. Again, my name is Dr. Mary Wild. I have various resources if that would be helpful for you. A parenting membership called Compassion Parenting, where I do one-on-one coaching or group coaching to help us be in this state of grounded, loving presence. I also have a resilience program, resilience school, and core resilience strategies to help kids learn emotional regulation tools, because it's not part of the typical curriculum, unfortunately, and it really needs to be. And my heart is with you, and may you come to peace during this time of turmoil and join together in solidarity. Thank you.